the opportunity for something new to begin. And it is perhaps no coincidence that his identification with Dada began to take hold at just about the time that Duchamp began to allow, perhaps encourage, belief in his inactivity to become commonplace. As with his association with Dada, we might see Duchamp's cultivation of the appearance of inactivity as a means of summoning up another sort of blank force, a camouflage of apparent creative inertia by which he could pursue his interests undisturbed. Étant donné was to be initiated in secret in 1946 under the twin signs of this protective blankness. We still have a little while without images, but since Duchamp is anti-retinal, I hope that's all right with all of you, rather than having an image that's unnecessary on the screen. For all that it may have provided him with a new way to get free, Duchamp's identification with Dada was more complex than that. Blank force was not quite what it seemed. Duchamp's comments to Sweeney had continued. The blank force of Dada is very salutary. It told you, don't forget, you are not quite so blank as you think you are. Usually a painter confesses he has his landmarks. He goes from landmark to landmark. Actually, he is a slave to landmarks, even contemporary ones. In Duchamp's view, Dada's primal blankness paradoxically set artists free by telling them only that they themselves were not blank, not the originary points of creativity modern art encouraged them to believe. Dada sweeps the past away, but only to reveal how implacably connected one is. The typical painter Duchamp describes goes from landmark to landmark, yet his comments imply an alternative to this enslavement. Landmarks may be distinctive parts of a landscape, but they can also be made, and thus they can also be altered, moved, or demolished. Landmarks may be unavoidable, but the artist's freedom lies in the capacity to create his or her own landmarks by appropriating ones that already exist if necessary, which is exactly what Duchamp did when he reached for Dada to define himself in New York during the 1940s. The mutability of landmarks means that they can become temporal as well as topographical points of reference, helping artists see where they are by showing them where others, including themselves, have already been. Identity becomes contingent, dependent on one's relation not only to tenuously sighted objects, but to actions across time as well as space. Dada's blank force and the landmarks it mercilessly exposes provided Duchamp with a way of relating not only to the past, to history, and to his contemporaries, but to his very identity. For most of the individuals we associate with Dada, the question of identity was a central concern. Indeed, the Dada self was an entity in flux, and plays of identity were commonplace among its participants. For example, the Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. Although he made a number of self-portraits during his long life, Duchamp's Dada-era forays into self-fashioning are distinctive as a group. In Buenos Aires in 1919, as James McManus has traced in his catalog essay, Duchamp made physical changes to his appearance by assuming a tonsure. Perhaps initially the result of an unusual treatment for an infection or for thinning hair, it was soon to become emphatic, identifying Duchamp as a célibat with its attendant associations of withdrawal from the world and rebirth. Duchamp, with the assistance of Man Ray, documented his appearance in this guise in photographs over the next 2 years, during which time Duchamp also presented the world with perhaps his best-known alter ego, Rose C'est la Vie. The tonsure Duchamp and Rose were to be followed in 1923 by this wanted poster showing Duchamp to have a number of aliases, and the following year brought Duchamp's shaving cream portraits with Man Ray and the Monte Carlo Bond. In short, Duchamp's self-fashionings during the post-war Dada years were the most physically transformative of his life thus far. Given this association of Dada with self-fashioning, what insights into his identity might be gained from Duchamp's embrace of Dada in the 1940s? In the 1930s, when he was first at work on the box in a valise, Duchamp developed the concept of the infrathin as a way of thinking of the liminal distinctions between seemingly identical objects, or the almost imperceptible relation between two states. Designing the cover, contributing the note on tobacco, smoke, and the imberthin, and providing additional images, including this photograph, a projected portrait of himself at the age of 85, an inversion of Duchamp's actual age of 58. With its strong lighting emphasizing the wrinkles, veins, and furrows of his face, the image is but an intensification of Duchamp's contemporary identity as it was already understood in New York, an elder, withdrawn from the creation of art, perhaps blind to painting's retinal appeal, but possessing still the inward sight of the wisdom that comes with age and experience. In view, this self-portrait was juxtaposed with a portrait of the young Duchamp. An imagined gulf of half a century separates them, yet they're the same person. Or are they? During the last quarter century or so of his life, there was, so to speak, not one Duchamp, but two, separated by the merest of existential intrathins. One was the Duchamp slowly being recognized as one of the most important artists of the 20th century, an artist who had capped his extraordinary accomplishments by apparently giving up art in 1923, and who was to become, by the 1960s, the focus of a multitude of museum and gallery exhibitions and popular and scholarly articles. The other Duchamp was Duchamp the Elder, who, when not spending his time just breathing, would generously lend his time and assistance to those curious about his younger counterpart. This dual persona of youth and old age gave Duchamp an imagined temporal space from which to negotiate his past, but it also gave him a new way to conceive a new relation to time itself. Time had been an important element in Duchamp's previous work. He conceived the large glass as a delay in glass, on one occasion allowing dust to settle on its surface over some months, as documented by Man Ray in Dust Breeding. But Duchamp was also concerned about time's passage and its corrosive effects on works of art. For the large glass, he decided to sandwich his materials between sheets of glass in hopes of preventing the yellowing and fading that is the usual result of age in oil paintings on canvas. And when works from the Ahrensburg collection went on display, Duchamp wrote to a friend, "Did I tell you how struck I was by how fresh most of my canvases look and in what good condition, technical, seen under strong museum lighting?" Duchamp's interest in how his paintings aged points to another concern that began to voice, starting just about the time that more of his works began to go on public view at the end of the 1940s. The possibility that a work of art, like its creator, could die, leaving, as Duchamp put it, museums to serve as mausoleums. In 1963, on the 50th anniversary of the Armory Show, he remarked, "I think that emanation from a work of art doesn't last more than 20 or 30 years and the work dies, especially in painting. The time is difficult to estimate, 20 years, 30 years, more or less. I mean, for example, my nude is dead, completely dead. The noise around it has nothing to do with aesthetic emanation." The blank force of encroaching mortality was not the only way to negotiate the passing of time, however. To consider another way of thinking about time's passage, we might turn to Duchamp's treatment of bottle rack for the box and a valise. Sometimes considered the first ready-made, the bottle rack had originally been kept by Duchamp in his Paris studio before the First World War, and it was lost shortly after his departure for New York in 1915. 2 decades later, Duchamp and Man Ray purchased a new bottle rack in order to provide the journal Cahiers d'Art with a photograph. Shortly thereafter, Duchamp used the half-tone printing block from the Cahiers d'Art illustration to create the image used in the box and a valise. By the time this photograph was made, the bottle rack and Duchamp's other ready-mades had been embraced by the surrealists as the forerunners of their own erotically charged objects. Accordingly, the bottle rack sympathetically transmuted itself. Man Ray's photograph heightens its mysteriously anthropomorphic character, and Duchamp's subsequent manipulations would further emphasize this quality. However, the photograph of the bottle rack is also a meditation on past time, albeit a subversive one. Its enigmatic expressiveness was heightened by an almost painterly mottling of the bottle rack surface. Man Ray and Duchamp deliberately prepared the photograph so that the bottle rack they purchased, despite the new sheen of its zinc plating, appears to have gained a patina in the intervening time since its first inception by Duchamp some 22 years earlier. Taking time into their own hands, they mimicked the corrosive processes associated with its passage to generate a work that would itself be the eventual victim of these same forces. Their trickery yielded a backhanded celebration of the bottle rack's conceptual durability, but qualified it as well. Its manufactured patina suggests another way that objects age, by the slow accumulation, layer upon layer, of ideas, associations, and interpretations generated by a succession of viewers over days, weeks, months, and years. Meanings accrue over time, and so can identities. During the 1940s, Duchamp learned to make casts from the human body, a process he used for the central figure of Étant Donné. Around 1945, Ettore Salvatore, his instructor in this process, made a life mask of Duchamp, and Michael Taylor has, I think, convincingly argued that the portrait of Duchamp at the age of 85, and here's a variation without the glasses, was probably made immediately after the cast was made, as fine particles of what appears to be plaster can be seen on Duchamp's skin and hair. These particles are also a sort of patina, dust breeding as time passes. But unlike the surface of the large glass or the bottle rack, or for that matter, the subject of a life mask, Duchamp was rarely a passive participant in these processes. In the 1940s, Duchamp's work took on a newly visceral physicality, the most obvious result being the explicit carnality of Étant Donné. But Duchamp also embodied the shift in himself. In 1946, the year he began Étant Donné, he made Wayward Landscape, the unique piece for a deluxe box and a valise that would go to Maria Martens, the woman he loved and who inspired the creation of Étant Donné. The drawing medium is semen, presumably Duchamp's own, thus making this work a sort of self-portrait. But even in this abrupt spurt are intimations of time's passage. Duchamp's gesture harks back to the bachelor's ordeal in the large glass of some 30 years earlier, but it was also a deeply private gift to an ultimately unattainable woman some 2 decades younger than himself. Time also figures in TIFFs, the unique piece made also in 1946 for the box of Mata, the youngest among the surrealists. TIFFs presents a portrait in terms of strategically taped hair clippings and a few lightly penciled marks. We can't really say whose hair or portrait it is, but we could think of it as a sort of counterpart of Duchamp's Dada-era pictures of himself with a tonsure. Like dust, hair clippings are usually just swept away as refuse, but a lock of hair is also often kept as a memento of those who are no longer with us. Near the end of his life, Duchamp was asked whether he thought Dada had really been understood in the United States. He answered yes, but then he added, "Except having been there, there's always a deformation, a distortion of this in souvenirs, and even, you know, when you tell a story about that, you, in spite of yourself, change the story as you saw it, because you have not an exact memory, or you want to twist it anyway for the fun of it. So the history of these things becomes so distorted in the end that it's very difficult to get a real picture. It becomes more important in the memory of it, the remembrance of it, than it actually was at the time, as usual." Duchamp achieved an understanding of the past, his past, through pictures. Pictures that in their deformations and distortions tell us as much about memory as they do about what might really have been. Confronting and dealing with the past and the passing of time means coming to terms not only with its effects on our experience and understanding of works of art, but also on our ever-changing, aging bodies. As he had in the Dada years, in the 1940s, Duchamp again subjected himself to transformations in his identity, transformations largely related to the effects of time's passage on and through his body. We might say this process started via a surrogate, Duchamp's compensation portrait for the first papers of surrealism. Duchamp appropriated the image from Ben Shaw's photograph of a farmer's wife, a victim of the Great Depression's hardships. David Hopkins has discussed this as a sort of reincarnation of Rose C'est la Vie, but there is another important aspect of her identity in addition to her gender, her lined and drawn face. This is a woman whose hard life appears to have prematurely aged her, an experience in which time has been compressed to a painful degree, and whose effects are visible in her face. Just as Duchamp's aged and vulnerable visage in the portrait at 85 presents a still more dramatic telescoping of time. Duchamp would not quite live to the age conjured in this photograph, but in the years to come, he would use the processes of art, history, and even celebrity to interrogate the nature of identity through time. Such images by and of Duchamp remind us that aging is not death, although there may be the merest of infra-thin intervals between them. Duchamp grew old before our eyes, but rather than estranging us from his past, his continued use of explorations of identity into his old age and the pictures of them that resulted bring us into immediate and continuing contact with what had come before and how it has changed through time. Thank you. I don't know if we have, I think I went wrong. We have time for questions? Yeah, gladly. Yeah. Michael. Hello, Michael.
Hi. I had a quick couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Really interesting paper. You mentioned the matter what. And one thing I can add to that is Denise Brown Hare, when she took the photographs of Duchamp's studio after his death, found some envelopes filled with pubic hair, head hair, and underarm hair that she felt were of the same color. Of course, we have to take them to the same FBI laboratory that discovered this, if such a place exists, you know.
Well,
but
the problem is that we need DNA testing now. I think that was not available when they were taken the first time.
But the evidence, a brunette and a redhead, it's pretty compelling when you see the work. I think it's Duchamp and Maria. I think the date of 1946 is also interesting because it would be exactly at that time when they're doing the body casting and they have to shave, you know.
Yes.
So, but my real point was really about Dada. I think that Dada was a loaded term in the early 50s, and I think that one of the things that struck me was, you know, you can make an opposition between Dada and abstract expressionism, but you should always remember that Harold Rosenberg, in his action painters, had invoked Holstenbeck's En avant Dada.
Absolutely.
And I think that must have been a great affront to Duchamp, you know, this idea that art, you know, the arena to act comes out of Holstenbeck. Holstenbeck says you've got to make art with a gun in your hand. He leaves that out. But this idea of art as action being taken from Holstenbeck, turned around, and then recast for someone like de Kooning and Pollock is pretty amazing.
Well, and there's something very similar happens with Robert Motherwell's work on the Dada anthology, which Duchamp did help him extensively with, but around 1948 through when the book was published, actually published in '51, Motherwell also starts sort of recasting certain aspects of Dada to fit what he saw as the sort of creative needs of himself and his fellow artists. So he talks about, there are a couple of talks like the School of New York where he talks about how an artist's most difficult decisions are in what they reject and refuse to do. And he refers to Duchamp and Mondrian as having made these very difficult choices. And I'm sure that's also not what Duchamp had in mind when he started working. Working with Motherwell. Thank you,
Great
Michael.
paper.
Yes, Kathy, it's a fabulous paper and so thought-provoking.
Thank you.
And I wanted to add your comment about this identity of Duchamp as resource for historians of modern art is such a relevant one because for the Picasso 40 years of his art show, Alfred Barr is quizzing Duchamp about Picasso, and did Picasso really know about Einstein? And Duchamp is trying so hard to make clear more realistically about what that situation was, and it had to be terribly frustrating for him because he was the one who was engaged with science. It wasn't Picasso. Yeah. And Rainer Banham also, in the Machinist Scene at the End of the Mechanical Age, uses Duchamp as a resource. So this notion of taking on that, being willing to take on the Dada identity, is such an interesting one. And in this interview, and Carol Janis is sitting here, so he was there watching this happen. What's so striking in that interview is how he's determined to resist the term if it's going to mean Zurich Dada. But if it's the eternal Dada spirit, then that's okay. If it's Rabelais, Jarry, et cetera, then he'll accept the term. And so this, and that's probably not clear then in the public's mind.
No, or even in most of the sort of, what you could say is the smaller art world's mind also. But I see that as sort of a general tendency in some of Duchamp's interviews, where he was, because many of these interviews were conducted with people who were also friends. Duchamp, I think, was perfectly capable of using a term like Dada or futurist or revolutionary in a pretty casual way in conversation. But then when it gets turned into a formal interview situation, he immediately backs off and says, no, it doesn't mean anything. That's not, because I think he doesn't want to get pinned down in that specific way.
And this image of Picasso, and you really sense that frustration that Picasso is the modern artist at that point, who's getting all the attention and he's not, and you can see how there's strength in numbers. Even though he's not a joiner of groups, there's an advantage at that point to taking that on.
Absolutely.
Anyway, just a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you very much. Thanks again to Anne and Jim for inviting me. Oh, please.
Sorry. I just want to go back to the connection with abstract expressionism for just a moment in the late 40s, and this idea that Motherwell is sort of turning Dada into something that he and his colleagues can use. But I think it's 49, it's included in the anthology. Hulsenbeck writes a new Dada manifesto in 1949.